Hey, Brad.
Hi.
Today, when we record this on May 2nd, 2020, it's World Naked Gardening Day.
Go on.
Get ready for the annual World Naked Gardening Day, WNGD. People around the globe are encouraged on the first Saturday of May to tend to their portion of the world's garden unclothed as nature intended.
So we just started, we basically had some green onions, some like scallion type
they're great
things that we cut down. And because it's such an ordeal to go get more groceries when you need them, we instead decided to put the ends in a little glass full of water by the window.
And they keep growing, right?
And they keep growing. And I actually cut some up and put them in a thing. So does that mean I'm a gardener now?
Take your clothes off.
Does that mean it's time to disrobe?
Time to shuck it.
So did you actually look at the hashtag?
I did not look at the hashtag.
What did you?
But when I went to WNGD.org, which I wouldn't do because there are a lot of elderly naked people.
Oh, good.
I mean, look, it's a lot.
Does it seem to you like nudity has just become kind of like accepted across the social internet lately?
I feel like there are generational changes.
Right. I feel like the institutional safeguards for like, hey, that you're about to see some naked people are just sort of like falling one by one.
Well, but also at the same time, like I think the fact that we're trying generally to be less judgy about people's bodies means that the younger generation just doesn't give as much of a shit as like not having to go through the ordeal of 7th grade gym showers where like, you're tormented by the older kids.
Yes.
Has changed people's views on these things, maybe for the positive.
Yeah. It's more that I'm surprised to see companies following those trends because they would cater to the Prudiest common denominator.
Oh yeah. But look, now they can micro-target advertising so effectively that if Steakums thinks that you want to see some dick pics, they can get them to you.
Oh man. Okay. Well, that's the end of that conversation. I got nothing else to say there.
Welcome to Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad. It's Saturday morning. Hello. Hi, Will.
Hello, Brad. How are you doing?
We both got the bed head today. I don't even wear a hat. That's how comfortable I've gotten with our arrangement here is that I don't even wear a hat to these things anymore. You just get the full.
Look, it's you got the shaggy. I remain in envy of people who can do the mohawk. I think that's got to be my move because the hair over my ears is making me crazy now.
I was gonna say 2 weeks in a row we've talked about a mohawk. I feel like some changes are afoot.
Well, I mean, I got to sell the family on it first. I'm not the only stakeholder here.
Have you guys discussed a home haircut? We've talked about that, right?
Gina's ready to go. She's been ready to go since she was like, you need a haircut the week we locked in.
We have been talking about it for a couple weeks now, and I think I'm ready to pull the trigger.
I think I might do like I have clippers, so I might get her to do like a fade on the side as if I was 17 years old.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm going for because it's pretty hard to screw that up.
You say that, but I think that there's probably more to it than we realize right now. We'll find out.
At the same time, even if it does get screwed up, like what is the harm?
Yeah,
what's the downside? Like by the time we're out in the world again, it'll have grown back. So whatever.
It's not like you broadcast to thousands of people 3 or 4 times a week from your house. There's a lot of
ways to cover up.
Oh, that's true.
Where necessary. There.
That's very true.
Yeah. So,
how are you holding up this week, man?
I'm all right. Stuff's just kind of rolling along, I guess.
Yeah, it seems right.
Yeah,
that seems right.
Not much new. I mean, I could talk about various equipment failures and like the Amazon packages I'm waiting for to replace those, but whatever.
My RAM for the Mister shipped.
Nice.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, like just shipped?
It just shipped. Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine.
We talked about it on the little patron bonus app.
Yeah,
a few days ago
meeting.
But I got mine.
Yeah.
But I forgot I haven't said that on an actual
on an official
episode yet. I've been playing Super Nintendo games and Sega CD games and sacrificed a goat last night to get Neo Geo working.
What was the first thing you played?
On the RAM?
Yeah.
Super Mario World.
Yeah.
That's the benchmark.
Good.
Yeah. It works.
Sounds right.
It seems pretty spot on.
Man, I can't wait.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
It's fun stuff.
My robot, I got all the parts for my robot, and then I realized I forgot to order an axle, so I got to order a bar to make axles out of. But other than that, I'm ready to go.
Yeah, and then you can command your robot to make RAM for you.
I mean, I wish.
Robots
command my robot to spin a wheel.
Robots can build anything because they're tireless, right? They can work 24/7. They don't need sleep or food or other human necessities.
Look, as long as it's quiet and doesn't wake me up, I don't care.
If you just tell your robot to get to the point where it can fabricate integrated circuits, microchips, then it'll get there eventually, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you just tell it.
Several centuries from now, it will produce a chip foundry.
Yeah. I mean, eventually it'll evolve and then it'll take over. And so we watched WALL-E last night. This is totally off topic, but we watched WALL-E last night with my daughter for the first time in years. And I realized that movie is about the robots taking over, right? WALL-E gains sentience. And then he leans his head in and he touches the other robots and the spark goes. And everywhere he goes, he spreads sentience around. He teaches the robots how to wave. He teaches them how to feel. He gives them the gift of consciousness.
Yeah, they recognize the value of robot togetherness. And then they realize, hey, we don't need the meat bags anymore.
No. Then they work with the meat bags to build a new civilization that celebrates meat bags and robots alike.
It's an optimistic version of that tale.
I mean, look, it's nice that there's one of those versus thousands of others.
Yep, that's fair.
There's like 8 Terminator movies. We don't need more of those. We're good.
Yeah.
Should we talk about the topic at hand today?
Yeah, sure, I guess. No, I don't want to sound down on it. I'm actually like super interested to talk about this. I know a lot of people are going to be pretty upset about it, but it sounds potentially pretty cool to me.
I think so. So we're going to talk about moving laptops to ARM. Specifically, a couple of weeks ago now, Business Insider ran a story about Apple moving MacBooks to ARM processors from Intel,
which is something you've been hearing about for basically years at this point, right? But this was a much more concrete, like, here's a rough timetable, here's like a pretty detailed list of all their plans. Like, it seems like it's pretty imminent.
Yes, that is, I think so. 2 things that are important about the story. One is that they specifically say it's going to be the A14, which is the version of the SoC that's going to ship on this year's flagship iPhones, 2020 flagship iPhones, and next year's, the next batch of iPads as well, obviously. Yeah. They have some specifics about hardware, in that they're saying that it's going to be the chips designed for the MacBooks are going to be much faster than the ones that run in the iPhones, but they are going to share some of the infrastructure things that have shown up in the most recent iPad Pro. For example, the iPad Pro has 4 cores that are dedicated to performance intensive workloads, and then another 4 that are just designed to handle low power tasks to make the battery last a really long time.
I didn't know they were doing that. Like, I guess I'm just behind on Apple's CPU design, but
It's something they didn't talk about. I saw Gruber talked about it when they showed how the iPad Pro worked, the new one. But they just pitch it as, hey, we've highly optimized this. In the keynote, Phil Schiller stands there and he talks about having four highly optimized cores for more normal computing tasks or whatever.
Yeah. Speaking of Phil Schiller standing there.
Yes.
On stage, Gruber linked to an old YouTube video in this blog post of Steve Jobs talking about the move to Intel.
Oh, the secret double life.
The secret double life. OS X has been living a secret double life for the last 5 years. Every version we have made has also secretly compiled on x86. And I worry about getting into idolatry a little bit, but I really miss his stage presence.
He had a way of dialing down to the key thing.
I really miss the way he presented stuff. It was just very effective. Anyway.
Yeah. So the rumor in this Bloomberg piece said that specifically the first Mac processors will have 8 high performance cores and 4 of the energy efficient cores.
Okay.
Versus 4 and 4 for the iPad Pros.
Do you have any sense of what qualifies as like a low power task? Like what sort of thing the low power cores would be running? I feel like you can envision the higher performance stuff, obviously, as anything with like higher compute requirements. But like, I wonder what the sort of lower idle-ish processes are that run on those.
So my guess is it's stuff that's anything that runs with the screen off. Right. Okay. So things like checking, receiving push notifications that tell you to check email or to, that you got a Twitter message or that your map turn signal is updated.
Okay, just any like file system indexing or any nuts and bolts stuff like that.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. My bet is updating apps in the background. My guess is also stuff like the window manager.
Okay.
So things that handle basic draws, not 3D stuff necessarily, but things that render the springboard and the grid of icons and render basic windows.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think my guess is that we'll see, if there weren't WWDC talks about that last year, my guess is that there's some this year that will illuminate that a lot.
I'll mention, just because you mentioned WWDC, that Gruber speculated that if this is happening on the timetable that is being reported, that they will announce it next month.
I mean, every other time they've switched architectures, so when they switched from the Motorola chips to the PowerPC chips, and then from the PowerPC chips to the Intel chips, they provided at least a 6-month window for developers. The word from Gruber's talked about this for years, but the idea that Mac has been compiling on ARM for years is not a new idea, and is definitely something that's been happening by the leaks and stuff that come out of Apple.
Yeah. Also, it just makes sense, right? Like, we should clarify here that Apple essentially owns the IP of the chips it makes in its mobile, correct? Versus licensing it from Intel for laptops.
Well, no. So with Intel, they buy the chips. With ARM, they license the chip design and then spin up from there. Okay. So Intel makes all of the x86 chips that go into Apple laptops.
They're just buying like units in volume at that point. They don't even own the design of those. Oh yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah, okay. No, Intel
because Intel's not. Okay, so maybe I had it backwards. Like, Intel is not doing any custom work on those chips. Those are just off the shelf mobile x86.
Well, okay, Apple's a big enough vendor of Intel CPUs that maybe if Apple says, "Hey, we would like you to do this in your next chip,"
right,
then Intel will do that. Okay. Right. But they're still going to sell that same chip to Dell and to Microsoft.
Okay, that's the distinction that I was trying to make, was whether Intel was making custom x86 chips for Apple or not.
Well, what they may do is give them custom clocks and cache sizes and stuff like that.
Okay.
Stuff that's easy to change.
Okay, but it's not like on the consoles where the console makers give a very specific wish list of features and they get a custom chip out of it.
Right. Okay. It is not a two-way conversation in that same way.
Right. But in the case of ARM, they can do that with themselves, right? They can dialogue with their own chip designers.
Yeah. So with the SoC, this is why they're spending so much money on research for the last, since they started building the A series of chips and took, prior to the iPhone 5 or 6, they were doing Samsung. They were running Samsung SoCs. So they were based on ARM cores, but then Samsung would pick a GPU, presumably with Apple's input, and put it in. Now, Apple has that whole team in-house, and they're doing they're picking the ARM core that they license. They're picking all of the other stuff that goes into that SoC, including the GPU, the configuration of the GPU, so the amount of memory that's dedicated to GPU, memory that's dedicated to CPU, any additional processors like the APU that they have in for like background tracking stuff in the background as part of the SoC. They do they can add stuff like H.265 acceleration. They can add acceleration for the HEIC, their photo/video format that they use for the live photos. All of that stuff that, if they were dealing with an Intel processor, may or may not get in, and may be integrated in a timeline that's much later than they want for their marketing and product goals. They can just put into the SoC, and there's both performance. Often there's performance benefits. There's also cost benefits for doing that stuff on the SoC instead of on separate chips inside the design.
Sure. So it makes a lot of sense from technical and business standpoints.
I mean, look, the one thing that Apple has always wanted is the ability to control. Like, they love controlling the hardware and the software and making sure that those things are a real tight loop. And with the Intel architecture, that's never going to happen because Intel's never going to let them build their own chips. With ARM, it's totally possible. And they've spent literal billions of dollars building the team that can do that.
Right. So trying to think where to start with this, because there's a lot of little nuggets of information in that Business Insider story. And then there's like the bigger question of like, how are they going to handle this transition, and how are they going to ease existing software into the new ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera? Like, where do you think is the most relevant place to start there?
I think, there's an interesting example case of what has been, of somebody who's been doing this for a fairly long time now and has had a couple of fits and starts along the way. Because Microsoft has been shipping ARM, Windows on ARM since like 2017, 2016.
Yeah.
The Surface X Pro, which is probably the highest profile of those devices, of those ARM devices, is the one that people always reference. And it's the obvious comparison is to look at it and say, oh, this is just like a new version of the Surface RT, which was the first time they tried to ship an ARM compatible CPU way back when Windows 8 was new, which was like 2013 or 2014 or maybe even 2011. And it was bad. It was a disaster. It didn't run apps. It only ran stuff from the Windows Store. There was nothing in the Windows Store because the Windows Store was brand new, and you could kind of run a bad cross-compiled version of Office on it. Since then, they shit-canned the first version of Windows that ran on ARM, and they made they made Windows on ARM actually pretty good. So now, if you have Windows on ARM, it runs everything from the store, all the UWP packages, all that stuff. But they also built in an emulation layer for 32-bit x86 compatible apps. So not 64-bit x86 compatible apps, but 32-bit compatible apps. So that means there are even a handful, like you can even run Adobe stuff, right? So you can't run. I'm thinking the list is, you can't run Premiere, After Effects, Audition, or Flash, or some of the other deeper tools, but Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, and Lightroom all come in 32-bit versions still.
Any idea why this translation layer doesn't support 64-bit stuff? Is it just a level of complexity thing?
My guess is that the performance was bad.
Okay.
Yeah, for reasons that are terrifying. I don't know.
You linked a little thing in the Microsoft knowledge base called How x86 Emulation Works on ARM. And it sounds like it's basically like an instruction translation kind of setup.
I mean, that's how emulation almost always works. It's usually like a wrapper from one instruction to another, right?
Yeah.
So this brings up the other point. One of the reasons Microsoft works with ARM manufacturers to design the chips for the Surface, but they're not doing that work in-house. So they may not have, they can put a block of chip on that will accelerate x86 apps by making these register conversions easier. But Apple can actually just, make all of their, if they want to devote a substantial amount of die to making old apps run well, they can.
Okay. Do you think that's likely?
Hardware dedicated to that? I don't know.
I guess what really matters here is what the real world implications of this are going to be for people who have existing workflows.
I mean, so that leads to the bigger, the much bigger question, which is this something that's going to push across the entire Mac product line from MacBook Airs all the way and Mac Minis all the way up to Mac Pros? And I mean, I think if it does, that'll be a really gradual transition because, like you said, the people who are using high-end Mac workstations and even iMacs to a lesser extent are probably pretty dependent on applications that may or may not be backwards compatible. I was going to say the other thing about the 64 32-bit division, there aren't any 32-bit Mac apps anymore that are for current versions of macOS.
Right. So they have to solve that problem. Yeah.
So presumably my assumption is that cutting off that 32-bit compatibility, last Mac OS?
Yes, I think that's right.
Whatever.
I think Mojave is the last one that runs 32-bit.
Yeah. So cutting off all of that stuff, my guess is a decision that was made to make the future transition to ARM easier.
Okay.
But I don't know enough about how chip design works to know why. It just doesn't seem like it makes any sense for them to get rid of 32-bit backwards compatibility if there's not some other reason to do it.
Sure. So I mentioned earlier on the Steve Jobs presentation about moving to Intel. So obviously we have a very kind of obvious public example of this transition or this type of transition happening before. Do you think there are any lessons to take from that transition that can be applied to this one, or has like software and chip design changed so much in the last 15? When did they switch to Intel? Like
it was mid 2000s.
15 years ago.
Yeah, 12, 15 years
now,
ago.
Now we have like much more robust virtualization and stuff like that. Like, is it even Is it even relevant to look back to the x86 transition and like Rosetta and all the stuff they did then, or is the world just too different now?
I think it should be simpler now than it was then, right? If you look at like a lot of the problems with the Intel transition were that the emulated software was pretty slow. I think that now we're looking at processors that are fast enough, and in the case of the MacBook Air versus iPad Pro, the A13 in a lot of ways is faster. The A13X or whatever's in the iPad Pros is faster than the MacBook Airs, especially in single-threaded apps, which I would assume a lot of your backwards compatible stuff will be.
Is that all? So, I mean, I'm probably springboarding to a different topic too fast here, but is that all relative to like wattage, power and heat and all that stuff? Like, is that saying like at a given kind of TDP or whatever, this one is going to perform faster? Because obviously, like in the mobile space, like power draw and heat are bigger concerns than in a laptop. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think in that case, the marketing number that they used is explicitly like in the configurations that they ship those devices, right? Okay. So, but I mean, the question of if you're looking at how much performance per watt can you get out of a machine, you're probably going to have a better time with ARM and a custom GPU than you will with Intel and Intel integrated or AMD or even NVIDIA graphics.
So actually, maybe that's a better way to ask this question is like, because ARM is so mobile centric, like, do we even have any real world examples of people scaling the architecture up to like a much bigger, beefier use case? You know what I mean? With like much higher, power draw and heat output, but also, corresponding power increase, like compute increase.
I think that there are even ARM data centers.
Oh, huh. Interesting. I guess you're kind of, like you see, like when they announced the Raspberry Pi 4, they were showing off like, oh, here's a cluster of Pi 4s as a web server and stuff like that.
So,
but I meant more like on die, like the actual silicon being beefed up as opposed to just here's a bunch of mobile-esque chips daisy chained together.
I think you're probably, I think that, I don't know the answer to this, Brad. I think the answer is it depends on how they configure the chips.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I think if you suddenly have a TDP that's 10 times that of a phone, right, then you're going to have a different experience. You're going to be able to get a lot more compute out of that than you will if you're like think about the amount of heat that a laptop can dissipate and the amount of battery a laptop can dissipate versus your phone.
Right.
And presumably we should see much better performance out of these ARM SoCs.
Yeah, that was my question, was just whether it scales like linearly with increased power, but I guess we don't know until they do it.
I mean, I think it depends on the chip. I mean, that is the challenge. I mean, that's why it's hard doing phone benchmarks in a lot of cases, is because if you're talking about comparing, a Qualcomm SoC versus the Apple SoCs, then they make very different choices about GPUs and stuff like that. And
right.
And you can't even really, and they're running different OSs. So it's hard to do apples to apples comparisons, which is why Apple phones usually, feel like they perform really well. And maybe the benchmarks are really good, but they have wildly different specs than like wildly inferior specs to an Android phone running a Qualcomm SoC.
Yeah. That's why I'm super curious about how these chips are going to work in a desktop or even quasi desktop environment where the use cases are very different and the performance needs are much greater.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that the performance needs are that much greater now, though.
Well, unless you're doing, like you said, Premiere and like some really heavy media processing type stuff. But eventually, like, ARM chips and MacBooks are going to start working their way up to that performance tier, right?
Well, and honestly, that's a really good example of a workflow that can be accelerated with hardware. So,
sure, yeah.
If you think about Premiere, the thing that takes a long time is rendering out your video, and the thing that takes a lot of math. And already with like an RTX card, even a low end RTX card, you can do the NVIDIA NVENC 2.0 stuff, which is, I don't know if people who work on TV broadcast would call it broadcast quality, but for anything short of network TV, the quality on that stuff is astounding.
Sure.
So
is the NVENC 2.0 the one that only runs on the Pascal cards? RTX cards?
Yeah, it only runs on the RTX cards.
Okay, because my experience with NVENC on a 1080 has not been amazing, but I guess that's the old version.
So NVENC on the 1080 on the previous cards was actively bad.
Yeah, the output is questionable.
Blocky and noisy in weird places, but they went through and fixed it. It took them 8 years, I think. But
yeah, okay.
The other thing is that you can do stuff like H.265 acceleration, which NVENC does now as well.
Right. So again, like purpose-built chips for exactly what they need.
Yeah, and just to give a point of context, like if I rip something in Handbrake on the CPU, it'll take a 4K disk will take 10 hours. And if I do it with NVENC 2 to H.265, which is a more computationally expensive codec, it takes like 2.
Wow.
It runs almost in real time.
And the results are quite good.
So the results, so the compression is better. The results are the visual quality is as good as the CPU, and it takes a fifth the time.
Okay. Now, obviously, Apple knows its customer base. They know what kind of acceleration they need to tune for.
Yeah, I mean that's the benefit of when they moved everybody to the App Store. That was the big benefit, right? Is they know they then can get analytics on all of the apps that are sold through their platform.
All right, so this is a very heady topic. It's very technical.
There's a lot.
Trying to figure out where to go next here.
Well, so it's not just that it's a heady topic. There's a lot of because there's so many variables. It's not like we're looking at Intel's. It's not like we're looking at Intel's product roadmap and saying, "Oh, okay, this CPU looks like it'll slot into a MacBook Air size." This is like if they can build whatever they want, what do they put in there for these devices? And I mean, this is why I think they start with the low end with the MacBook. So I guess the next question is what hardware, like what do these products look like? Do they change? Yeah. Are we going to see new industrial design, smaller, thinner, lighter laptops? Are they going to just take the time tested and MacBook Air design that's been around for 10 or 11 years now?
Yeah, you're talking even from like a marketing standpoint, like will they brand these as a new line of MacBooks as opposed to just like quietly saying, here's the new Air?
Well, yeah, or as a complete design refresh of the Air in addition to a hardware refresh.
Yeah, I guess in Apple terms, it would just be like the new MacBook Air tends to be how they do things.
I mean, maybe, but maybe these are lower end. Does this this is a product that directly competes with the iPad Pro, especially now that they have that Magic Keyboard, which, by the way, the Magic Keyboard is one of the things that Gruber listed as an indicator that probably the way you'll build these apps is on an iPad. You'll test these apps on an iPad with the Magic Keyboard running some developer version of OS X.
Like I feel like the increasing performance and usability of the iPad Pro is making the line between that tier and the MacBook Air blurrier than ever. Like at some point, don't they need to like eliminate a laptop tier? Like the iPad Pro is so close at this point. I mean, obviously not on the software end. Obviously, they're not letting you run OS X on it yet.
Yeah,
if they ever will. But you know what I mean? Like that stuff feels like it's converging in a way that there's going to be some redundancy in their product lines at some point.
I mean, but maybe not. Maybe the difference in the app ecosystem, in Mac and semi-open versus iOS or iPad OS and mostly closed is enough of a differentiator.
Sure.
This is the stuff that I'm really curious. Like, I can't wait to see how this all shakes out because it's just such a weird transition for them. And like having an iPad that's technically capable of running OS X and that you choose between, iPad OS and OS X when you buy it or when you boot it or something like that is the most un-Apple-y idea.
Yeah.
But maybe it's the right choice. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe the division in those product lines is more philosophical than technical at that point.
The other question I wonder is if they'll continue letting people dual boot Windows, because like if you think about you can get Windows on ARM now. I don't know if consumers can get it, but if Apple starts shipping MacBooks that would be compatible with it, I'm sure Microsoft will make it available if Apple makes it available for them. But like, the whole, hey, you can dual boot your Mac or you can run a VM in Parallels that has native hardware acceleration to run your Windows apps inside OS X was such a selling point early on in the rise of the MacBook. I can't imagine. I can't imagine they keep it. I can't imagine they keep Boot Camp, but I'm also really curious to see if they do.
I mean, it seems like the future of software design is openness, right? Like the way that even Microsoft is open sourcing a lot of its stuff now and following more kind of open source standards for design and stuff like that.
Just be funny to see Microsoft complaining about Apple closing their hardware to them.
I don't know. It's just, it seems like just as a selling point, getting rid of functionality like that is maybe a little risky.
I mean, yeah, but Apple loves that kind of risk. That is the most Apple risk imaginable.
That's true.
Hey, we're going to dump backwards compatibility for a bunch of shit people use, and it's really going to piss them off.
Yes, that's fair. That's fair. Apple is not a stranger to telling its user base to get over it.
Hey, we're gonna release a pencil peripheral for iPads, and then the next year we're gonna replace a new one that's not backwards compatible and is like 10% better and costs more.
Yes,
perfect. Nailed it.
From the old iPod connector to the Blu-ray drive to USB ports.
Yes,
long
to
history
the floppy
of
disk.
Yes, long history of just saying, nope, you don't need that anymore. Nope, figure it out.
Yep, here you go.
Yeah.
So my other question is like, does this roll up into so if they can do backwards compatibility for existing x86 Mac apps, so stuff that runs on Catalina and whatever the current version of OS 10 is, I can't remember the names anymore. I think that's an interesting. I think that puts them in an interesting position where they can download. You know, if your Adobe CC runs at close to native performance on this new SoC, then like there's no difference for consumers.
Sure.
Right. That's to me, that's the big test is it always boils down to Creative Cloud to Adobe on Mac hardware transitions.
Well, especially in the context of Adobe, even if there is a difference, even if there is some hit to performance or something like that, like how long is that going to be in place for it to really matter? Because with packages like that, you're basically paying a subscription fee at this point and you're getting updates constantly. So anybody who's current is like, what's it going to be, a year or 2 years at most before they just start transitioning everything native?
Hold on. Well, we got to step back a little bit. I would, as a paying subscriber for Adobe's products, I would describe their update cadence as somewhere between disappointing and inadequate.
Okay, fair.
Like, for example, on my Windows version of Photoshop, I can't open HEIC files in the year of our Lord 2020.
Can you open WebM?
I can open WebM finally.
Okay.
I think I can even encode WebM with Premiere now.
Without an add-on?
That took a really, I might have had to install an add-on. It took a really long time.
Okay, that's a good counterpoint. Maybe this transition will not be as smooth and expedient as I thought.
But I mean, the thing that's fucked up about that is the time, like Adobe owns desktop publishing. Adobe InDesign is the leader in turning digital stuff into paper, right, at massive scale, because Quark Express didn't make the transition from OS 9 to OS 10 effectively. So like they have massively benefited as a company as a result of like Apple making a transition difficult in the past. Sure. You'd think Adobe would be there front and center, ready to go. But
you think Adobe would do a lot of things.
Fair. Fair.
So, okay, do you think we can take it for granted that there will be some bumps in this transition? Like, there's no way they're going to just pull this off seamlessly, right?
Oh, look, we're going to hear from a lot of old developers. Like, remember when they dropped 32-bit support on iOS and all of the games that you bought the first, like, and now you can no longer get a no microtransactions version of Uno because that was a 32-bit app, and
they didn't update it.
Ubisoft updated it with a free to play up terrible Uno. Yeah. That's what. Get ready. Brace yourself.
So given that we are assuming that this will not be a flawless transition, what do you think is their pitch, like from kind of a marketing angle? What do you think their pitch is to the user base when they go before everyone and say, hey, we're making this big move. Here's how you're going to benefit. Like, here's what's better about these. Like, what are the easily explicable benefits of, is it, and I think you've said this before, like, is it, hey, this laptop now runs for 10 days on a single charge? Or like, just for kind of the average user, like what are the bullet points they run down and say, here's why this is better for you? So if they keep the existing industrial design for the MacBook Air, which I assume this is going to start with the MacBook Air because it's the obvious place I was looking for it in the BI story. I want to say that they said the first ones on the market will be the lower end chips, but I couldn't find that quote.
It makes a lot of sense because it's the audience that is least computationally that does the least computation. So if you give them a good web browsers and their Twitter app and the stuff that they use to ship shit on eBay or whatever it is, people who don't really use computers for.
Yeah.
Then with that they'll be able to get that audience is the least likely to be affected by these problems.
Yeah, here's a little tidbit from the BI story. It says the first Mac processors will have 8 high-performance cores and at least 4 energy-efficient cores.
Yeah.
So that sounds like what'll be in the first products that roll off the line.
I mean, that to me says either they're looking at, hey, here's the few. So, okay, they keep the existing industrial design. They say, hey, you have 3 days of battery, right?
Okay, yeah. That's a bullet point that plays with people, right?
Yeah, exactly. The other option is to make something that is, I mean, Johnny Ive's not there, so I think this is probably less likely now. But the other option is to make something that is dangerously thin and light that has a full day's battery life performance comparable to the MacBook Air.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't see the value of that.
What if it's clear? What if it's just a sheet of glass that's a screen?
What if it's the thickness of 6 playing cards stacked on top of each other?
Yeah, exactly.
I want a little bit of bulk, not too much, but I want a little bit of bulk in my laptop. I don't want it to feel like I could break it in half if I looked at it wrong.
That said, like I drop my phone once a month, probably, right?
Wow. I
drop my phone. I have a kid. I drop the phone all the fucking time. That's why I have a big chunky case in it now. I just gave up.
You got the OtterBox on there.
It's not that chunky, but it's close.
Okay.
The laptop, like I remember the last time I dropped a laptop, and it was in the whiskey basement in like 2011, and I dropped a MacBook hard enough it landed on something that dented took a chunk out of the aluminum.
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh, this is bad," and then it was fine.
But it's it's not limited to just dropping it. I feel like traveling, if you fly a lot, your laptop's gonna get a little beat up just going through TSA and stuff like that. Like I want it to. I hope the benefits are on the battery side and maybe the horsepower side, not on the thinner and lighter side.
I would hope after the great butterfly key debacle of the last 5 years, they've learned that the thinness and lightness of the current laptops is more than sufficient.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, to me, that provides an interesting differentiator for the iPads is if, hey, we made it chonky, but it has a huge battery versus, hey, the iPad is pretty thin. It's fine. If you want something thin, get an iPad. If you want something thick, get this.
Yeah. This is quite a lull.
I was just waiting. You looked like you had a question, and then you didn't look like you had a question.
I'm looking at this document deciding, I mean, again, this is such a it's such a thorny issue from so many angles. I'm trying to figure out where to talk about things next. And also, neither of us are CPU designers or software developers. Like some of this stuff is like,
hey.
Like for example, one of the questions I jotted down here is, and we touched on this earlier, is CPUs have a lot more hardware level virtualization features than they did last time something like this happened. So I want to ask hey, could VMs play a significant role here in easing this transition? But I don't know if either of us can actually speak to that with any authority.
No, I can answer that. Yes, that absolutely will help.
Yeah.
So if you look at the way we can containerize apps, even and if you look at how how much do you know about how Docker works?
I've got a decent understanding of it. I mean, is it kind of OS level virtualization as opposed to CPU level?
Kind of, yeah.
Okay. So because I'm familiar with that concept, using jails in FreeBSD because those run on the host system's kernel. Those are not they are philosophically containerized, but not programmatically. Is that the right term?
They're containerized for security, not necessarily for instruction compatibility.
They're sandboxed rather than virtualized, I think is probably the right way to actually describe that. They're running on they're running their processes right alongside the system processes. They're not
So the thing that people were using before Docker is called Vagrant, and it was basically like a VM manager that you could run up programmatically from a command line for things like running a development environment or something like that.
I mean, is that the best way to actually make this distinction? Is whether the container in question is running its own kernel or not? Is that kind of the way to?
I mean, so that's a virtual machine is running its own, would be running its own
that's what I mean.
kernel.
That's what I mean. Because like 10 years ago, if you downloaded VirtualBox and you wanted to,
yeah,
like you were running a full computer inside that container, like from the BIOS up, right?
So
and that's not always the case anymore. Like with the jails I was talking about, and I was going to ask, is that how Docker works too? That it's
Docker runs the bits that it needs, not the whole thing, is my understanding. But that's definitely not an expert on that.
That's what I'm getting at. Because I mean, there are very different hardware requirements for those two scenarios, right?
Yeah. So I mean, if you look at how Docker and Vagrant work, and if Apple decides to let people package old backwards compatible apps in that way. So they just bring the stuff that they need. Now, the difference is with Docker, you're running on different operating systems on the same architecture.
Okay.
With this, you're running the same operating system on different architectures, which, depending on how things work and what the application uses, and like if you're using APIs and you're writing everything in Xcode to one of their higher level APIs, like one of their higher level languages like Swift or Objective-C, then you'll probably be fine. If you're writing a lot of machine code and stuff like that, you're going to have to do some manual porting work, would be my guess.
Okay.
But I would bet that most stuff you can just dump over and it'll work.
Yeah.
Recompile and it'll work.
Sure.
Or hopefully put it in like the OS will handle that for you and put it in a container if you haven't recompiled.
I mean, just given the state of general development efforts from company to company these days, and the massive increases in compute power and specific features that ease stuff like this, I want to say that this is going to be a much smoother transition than the x86 one was.
So my guess is, like, if you think about, so in the x86 transition, I was at Maximum PC. We were working entirely on CC for the Mac people, right? And we did not transition to Intel Macs for the designers for at least 2 years.
Okay.
Because Photoshop hadn't ported over, and it was really slow on the Rosetta layer. I think looking at Microsoft is key here. My bet is that the Microsoft decision to only support 32-bit x86 is a backwards compatibility choice, and that they were looking at the number of apps that are 64-bit only versus the number of apps that are 32-bit only, and the number of apps that are, as we've discussed in the past, Microsoft's decision is to always err on the side of making more things run than fewer things run. So my guess is that they did the math and they're like, okay, we're going to include hardware acceleration for 32-bit because that makes sense. And that means we'll sacrifice 64-bit to meet the performance budget or whatever.
Right. And so the bet they're making there is just that anything that is 64-bit only is going to get ported natively sooner than later.
Probably still in active development and will be ported natively.
Yes.
Or it's a high performance computing thing that people who buy a ARM-based laptop aren't going to give a shit about.
Sure.
Like Premiere, if you're, So with Apple, since they've moved all the way to 64-bit, my guess is that they're going to support 64-bit x86 or x64 instructions in emulation and hardware on their ARM chips, even if that means they have to license something from Intel for a couple of years or AMD, whoever.
Sure.
So
another random question I just thought of. I mean, this will be a product line wide transition, right? Eventually, like inevitably, this is going to have to work its way up to Mac Pros, or do you think those will stick with Intel? Because I'm just trying to envision a full on tower, or I guess in Apple's case, like a trash can or a cheese grater.
Yeah.
But a freestanding full size computer with like a giant heatsink on it with an ARM chip underneath. Like, is that even?
What if it's silent?
That sounds incomprehensible to me right now. But like, is that where we're going?
Well, okay. So think about. I think it's more likely that those products disappear entirely.
Whoa.
I don't know. Like, I think there's 3 outcomes, right? One is that Apple stops making Mac Pros, which wasn't out of the question until they rolled out a new one a year ago.
No, but every time that rumor has circulated, I feel like the outcry is enough. Like, it may not be the biggest audience or market, but it seems like there is a very passionate attachment to the name Mac Pro for some people.
I don't think they give a shit about people's attachment to anything.
You may certainly be correct about that.
But like, look, they totally jettisoned the video editing market because they didn't update the product in 3 years, and the people who edit video are really concerned about performance, right?
Yeah.
So So like, look at who's still using that, and it's like audio engineers, and I mean, maybe they make a silent Mac Pro.
Huh. Okay.
I don't know what an ARM Mac Pro is. A weird. Regardless of what it is, it'll lag 3 or 4 years behind whatever happens next year.
Yeah.
That's my guess.
Okay.
I think iMac is an interesting question because if they can get Adobe on board with Photoshop fast, Photoshop and Lightroom and the other tools in the Photoshop, the photo editor tool chain, I think a lot of photo editors and even video editors these days are probably working on iMacs. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I have no. Our Mac Pro is just, we'll know more. Ask me again about that after they announce the laptops, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, it may be years before this happens, but I'm just fascinated to see a big computer with a lot of cooling in it that might be running this and what it would be able to do.
It's a silent desktop, Brad. Yeah. That's what we've always wanted.
There's some appeal there. So this is kind of tangential to this topic, but reading this story kind of reinforced for me that like Intel is kind of in a down period, aren't they, right now? Like,
I think things haven't been great.
We've been talking about I still don't know how to pronounce the name of this chip, but the 10th generation cores are out, like the 10900K as opposed to, the 9900K was the 9th generation. Like, I don't know that there's a colloquial pronunciation for 10900 yet.
This is off the tongue. This is the last iteration of Skylake,
yes,
right?
Yes, it is the last, according to the rumors. Obviously, Intel hasn't come out and said that, but yes, this new 10th generation core that's coming out like soon, or they just announced it. Comet Lake, I believe, is the name of it. But yes, it's the last version of Skylake, which is on what, 10 nanometer?
10 or 15, depending on which chip. I believe
still like very high thermals, like relatively low cores for the price points. Like it's not, not an impressive chip. Like people are looking at this and going, "Oh, this is pretty disappointing." And then meanwhile, we've talked about like AMD is delivering Zen 3 based chips. Their CEO said later this year.
Yeah.
But I actually started looking beyond that this week, and the leaked roadmaps say that they are going to have Zen 4 chips out like by the end of next year that are on a 5 nanometer process, which is actually, we didn't even mention that these Apple ARM CPUs are said to be on 5 nanometer as well.
Yeah, A14 is supposed to be 5 nanometer, which is, I think, the end of the line, right, for process strengths.
Yeah, but I feel like I heard that about 7 as well, so I don't know.
Fair.
Also, I know like next to fucking nothing about, CPU lithography or whatever.
Well, now they use X-rays. That's what I know.
Okay, but I do know like there are multiple, like TSMC apparently has like 3 or 4 different versions of their 7 nanometer process. So this, A, I'm throwing around terms that I have no business trying to explain, and B, don't really know what the differences are among those. Anyway, like the bigger point is just like, Apple's over here with their ARM chips, like AMD is rapidly moving forward with CPU fabrication, and I feel like Intel is just like way behind the curve on everything right now.
Well, so this is the way usually Intel moves in, like it's not like a sine wave, it's like plateaus, right? So okay. They have a big, huge spike, and then it levels off gradually, and then there's a big, huge spike, and then they level off gradually, and then there's a big, huge spike, and it levels off gradually. Is this
just the inevitable consequence of them enjoying like such market dominance for years that they didn't have to push very hard?
I think it's definitely partly that. I think the larger thing is that they have they used to sell this. They used to try to market this with a TikTok idea where you have.
I remember that.
Yeah, the tick is the good one. The new architecture, and then the talk is the process refinement to that architecture.
Right.
Or maybe it's the other way. I
think it's the other way around because I always thought that people had it backwards.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. The point is, which way is right doesn't matter on this case.
Yes.
The point is, they milk an architecture. I mean, they spend billions of dollars developing each new architecture, and then they need to amortize that out over 4 or 5 years. And when they get to the end of that time period, unless if anybody has done well that generation, if AMD has done well that generation, then they're going to be lagging.
Yeah.
Part of that is because of the way AMD does their chip design, where they do all those chiplets, right, that have one integrated bus on the whole thing, lets them make smaller changes, bigger changes on smaller parts of the chip without impacting the other stuff as much.
Okay.
Should we talk about I'm really curious. You wrote a really good question in here, and I have no idea why Apple hasn't started doing its own fab.
Yeah, because the story points out they are obviously still going to be working with TSMC.
Yeah.
I have to imagine that Intel does its own fabrication.
But Intel has always done its own fab.
Well, that's what I mean. They've been in that game for a long time. What I was going to say is I imagine spinning that business and that process up from scratch has got to be one of the more expensive undertakings that there are in tech.
It's billions and billions of dollars.
Right. And if it was anybody other than Apple, except maybe Amazon or Google, how many other companies have the amount of liquid capital just sitting there that could even pull it off? Very few.
Well,
but Apple, I haven't looked it up recently, but I seem to recall Apple running with a fucking insane amount of cash in the bank at all times.
Yeah, it's billions and billions of dollars.
And so they've gotten into their own CPU design in house now. At what point, maybe the only other answer besides the cost I can come up with is that maybe they already have such favored status with the partners they're working with that it's not worth it to them because they're already getting what they want.
Well, okay, so there's two things here. One is that Intel's process tech was always the thing that was driving the performance in their company. They over the last 40 years were so good at process shrinks and die changes and stuff like that that was a primary just competitive difference between them and the other CPU manufacturers in the 90s and late 80s and even into the 2000s.
Is that the situation where that was true right up until they started hitting the frequency limits on silicon and stuff like
Around
that?
Broadwell E was when that started to change, right?
Moore's law started breaking down.
Yeah, when the density of transistors, the cost of increasing the density of transistors stopped doubling every 18 months. That's when they started having issues.
It's around when you saw clock rates kind of stabilize as opposed to rapidly going up all the time, right?
Yeah, we've seen that happen a couple of times. That happened with the Pentium 4 era, because remember they originally designed that thing to take you to 5 or 8 gigahertz or something ridiculous, and it never happened because they couldn't manage the heat.
Yeah, we've been hovering between 3 and 4 for how long now?
Exactly. So AMD used to own their own foundries, and they spun them off 10 or 12 years ago now, more than that, mid 2000s, to a company called Global Foundries, which then competes with TSMC and all the other fabs. And the reason they spun it off was because they specifically said they couldn't afford to do both R&D for the chips and R&D for the fabs, because keeping the fab state of the art is a constant process.
Oh, sure.
Like that you're obviously not pulling out one machine and putting another machine in, but they have to have a constant upgrade plan for those facilities, or else they fall behind and they're valueless.
That makes sense. I am probably, as with most things, underestimating the complexity of keeping that business going. Even the tiny little bit that I know about chip fabrication, just the lengths that they go to, even on the molecular or even in the atomic level, to keep that stuff competitive, or is it or just mind-boggling?
Yeah, it's one of those things that it's better to just pay somebody who's good at it than and pay them to keep your business going. And Apple, with the number of ARM chips that they make, it's they're going to be a very important customer to a company like TSMC, which is an enormous fab. Yeah. But Apple will buy all the space that they need on the 3 fabs that they want to work on or whatever for the time period that they need it. Because that stuff's all predictable. In normal years, that stuff's all predictable. This year, who knows what's going to happen? Yeah.
Again, Apple is probably the only company I would actually ask this question about, just because A, they have so much money, and B, they are so obsessive about controlling every link in the chain.
But with this one, but with the fab especially, they can specify what they want so precisely and hold the company to it contractually, and the companies deliver really reliably. I think it's fine.
Also, I guess the good counterpoint to this is, I feel like, and this is anecdotal, but every time I see stories about supply chain problems with other electronics, it's pretty much always chalked up to demand for mobile being too great. Yeah. So I assume they're just getting everything they want. They're first in line for any capacity for manufacturing anyway, right?
Well, Samsung and Apple probably are the two big ones. Yeah.
Right.
So it makes me wonder if the coronavirus, the impact, we're starting to see manufacturing start cranking back up again in China finally. And I had written this question. I don't think it's a good question now that I think about it a little bit more. But if Apple has to choose between Mac and iPhone for ARM chips, obviously iPhone's going to win.
Yeah, that's the bulk of the business, right?
But also the number of Macs Apple sells in a year is a rounding error compared to the number of iPhones that they sell.
Right.
So probably it doesn't matter. Yeah. Probably they can make both.
There is I don't know if you saw, there is a short. I had it and I lost it. A short passage in that. I don't know. This is a Bloomberg story. Have we been saying Business Insider this whole time?
Yeah, it's Bloomberg.
Sorry, this is a Bloomberg
We'll put a link
story.
in the show notes.
Here it is. The switch away from Intel is complex, requiring close collaboration between Apple's software, hardware, and component sourcing teams. Given work from home orders and disruptions in the company's Asia-based supply chain, the shift could be delayed, according to their sources.
I mean, I think that makes sense.
So, yeah, there is some speculation about that already.
They've spent a lot of time on this. They're clearly not going to do it until it's ready.
Yeah.
I think if it happens...
it's a balancing act, right?
Yeah, it really is. And like if they roll, like right now, I think this said, and there was an analyst, I can't remember who it was, but it's somebody who is on my list of the good analysts and not the bad analysts, said, looking at first half 2016, 2021, which means they would announce it at WWDC this year. And then we would get some sort of developer preview, probably for iPads later in the year, maybe even in the summer.
Yeah.
And that would give people 6 months to a year to update their apps. I think that feels aggressive given what we know now. But since there have also been rumors that they're going to hold off on flagship phones this year, maybe they hold off on flagship phones, roll this out for the Mac, and it lets them. I mean, the thing that rolling out all of the same processor at the same time does is it doesn't give them time to scale fabrication. So if you look at how NVIDIA rolls out new GPUs, they usually pick one SKU, and often it's the high end, but sometimes it's the low end if they're moving to a new process. Yeah. So they'll take a late cycle die refresh of a mid-range part, like a 2060 level part, and they'll move it to the next process size down, which will make it run cooler and more efficiently at the same TDP. Or run faster at the same TDP, and then they'll test out that process on the old chip before they spin up the new chip that uses the process by default.
Right. And
I haven't seen any indications that Apple has a way to do that with this stuff.
Yeah.
Anytime you move to a new process tech, it's scary. And moving from 10 or 7 to 5 nanometers is a pretty substantial jump. So yeah. I don't know. We'll see.
Can they actually, from an investor standpoint, can they afford to not refresh flagship phones for a whole extra year?
I mean, look, I don't know what's going to happen in 2 weeks. You're asking about something that's going to happen in 4 months.
So. Yeah, I have to assume that constitutes enough of their bottom line that, I mean, they've got earnings reports to worry about at some point, right?
Is it worse to make 1 billion phones and sell 250 million, or not sell 250 million phones and not have 750 billion phones on 750 million phones on your books, right?
If I could answer that question,
we'd be making a lot more money.
I'd be a CFO somewhere or something like that.
Exactly. Hey, probably. Speaking of, I think this is as good a place as any to wrap it up.
Yeah. Is it time to thank our CFO?
I think we should thank our CFO. I'm going to take a moment because I need to make sure we haven't gotten any new. I didn't do this before the show, so we'll cut this bit out.
What if we just kept talking right through it?
We could keep talking through it and people could hear me type.
People love behind the scenes. That lesson has been reinforced to me over and over for the last 6 or 7 weeks that we've been doing this. I don't think there is anything too inside baseball.
Oh, well, there you go.
For people to be interested in hearing.
I'm typing in a 2-factor code right now. It's very exciting.
Fascinating.
2-factor login on our Patreon. So hackers beware.
Yeah.
Hold on. I'm still looking. Takes a minute.
Just got to fill that dead air.
Yeah. Keep going.
Just got to keep talking about how we're trialing Jitsi for this remote podcast instead of the Discord and Hangouts combo of doom.
I think it worked really well.
I think it's pretty good. It looks like, first of all, I know it's a hassle and a headache most of the time, but I love open source software because this thing is basically Google Hangouts, except that we were able to get really good detailed information about whether we had a peer-to-peer connection going.
Yeah.
We were able
to turn off AGC.
Yeah, we were able to turn off the automatic gain control by specifying a switch or an argument in the URL for the meeting.
Yep.
Like they give you control and options that you just don't have with most commercial products.
This is dangerously close to an advertisement. We don't accept advertisements here. No.
This is this call that we're in right now to record this podcast is literally the first time we've used this product. We don't have any association, but also again, it's a free product. So,
but you know who we do thank instead of advertisers, Brad?
Who's that?
We thank our patrons.
Yeah. I'm sorry, our what?
Patrons.
Yes.
Do it again.
Those. Nope. We're good. Keep going.
Yeah, especially, so everybody, thank you to everybody who contributes to the TechPod Patreon. The URL is www.patreon.com/techpod. And a special thanks this week to our executive producers, Andrew Cotton and David Allen. Thank you guys so much.
Yes.
And if you would like to find out how to support the podcast yourself and get access to our behind the scenes episodes, like the very first one, which went up last week, which was about planning.
Yeah.
And only planning. We did not talk about anything else.
Oh,
just plans for the podcast.
Certainly not the breaking news that happened right in the middle of it where I got my RAM from Portugal.
We did not talk about RAM from Portugal. We did not talk about misters. We did not talk about...
I definitely didn't open that thing right there in the middle of the recording.
Nope. And we didn't talk about other stuff that came up along the way. There were no distractions.
Nope.
It was 100% focused conversation about
business.
May podcasts.
Yep.
And you can get access to that if you subscribe to the Patreon as well as the TechPod Discord, which is it is consistently wonderful.
Oh yeah, I would not have gotten Neo Geo up and running on the Mister last night as fast as I did if I hadn't been able to ask for help, because that was a real boondoggle. Every time I dip into there's like 3 channels that I check in like once a week, maybe twice a week, just to kind of see what's going on. Yeah.
And the internet broadcasting, the music creation, and the Mister channels have all taught me stuff in the last week that I did not know. And it's been very good.
The Linux channel is a pretty great place to ask questions about stuff like that. I find.
And you can get access to the Discord for like $2 a month. So highly recommend. It's techpod.com/Patreon. I guess that'll do it for us this week.
Yeah.
See y'all next week.